All right, welcome to the first of what will hopefully be a series of questions and answers on philosophy and on Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism in particular. So, in my work, I very rarely get the chance, or certainly not as often as I'd like, get the chance to talk about deeper topics in philosophy. A lot of my work's focused on politics, and this may be surprising to those of you who don't know me personally, but I'm not that interested in politics. In fact, I'm interested in it really only as it is a chance to reflect on deeper issues in philosophy. And it just so happened that my career turned out that's where the opportunities were. And so I wanted to be able to spend some time going over what I think are really interesting issues in philosophy that people are wrestling with. And I'm not sure how often I'll do these, but if you have questions, and you can email them to don@donswriting.com and let me know, like, are you getting a lot of value out of this? Would you like to see more? Would you like to see less? So I'm going to dive right in. I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions you guys sent, but I'll try to get through a number of them today, and then, I'm keeping a backlog. So if I didn't get to yours, hopefully I will get to it soon. So here's the first one from Chase. Is objectivism due to a priori or a posteriori reasoning? And so these are philosophic terms that refer to how we know things. Do we know them prior to sense experience simply by virtue of the definition of those words? Or are they things that we know only through experience? And the short answer is neither. That objectivism rejects the a priori, a posteriori distinction. The key essay here is The Analytic Synthetic Dichotomy by Leonard Peikoff, which is in Ayn Rand's book Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And he goes really in depth into this, and it's a masterful essay, and I highly recommend reading it. But just to say a few things. So objectivism's view is that all knowledge starts with, we wouldn't put it as experience because that's kind of a loaded term philosophically, but it starts with perception. And everything is built on top of perception. There is no way of knowing that is just looking at words in a vacuum. And a better way to think of it is that objectivism thinks both deduction and induction are valid forms of knowledge, but that what we do is that we form inductive knowledge of reality, we form inductive principles, inductive generalizations, and then deductively we logically apply those to particulars. Now you can ask, is objectivism essentially inductive or deductive? Or more widely, is philosophy inductive or deductive? And the answer would be that objectivism is essentially inductive. And another key resource here is Leonard Peikoff's course Objectivism Through Induction, which you can find on YouTube. And the objectivist view is that all important philosophic knowledge is gotten by observing reality. And let me finish with two reasons why I think there's a temptation to see philosophy and objectivism in particular as deductive. And the first one is that objectivism starts with axioms. Existence exists, A is A, consciousness is conscious. And most philosophic systems, most philosophers who start with axioms build their systems deductively. But for objectivism, axioms they're known directly through perception, and it's not what we deduce from. So we don't say A is A and therefore, human beings should pursue their self-interest. Rather, axioms are known through perception, and they form the widest context for our knowledge. Not the context in which we deduce, they're the context really in which we induce. And it's not that we deduce anything from A as A, rather our implicit and later our explicit grasp of existence, identity, consciousness, causality. These allow us to induce our knowledge, and what they basically say is that if you violate the axioms, you've gone afield. They don't tell you what is true, but they tell you, like, you have not, if you reach a contradiction, there's a flaw in your reasoning. And so the axioms are just playing a much different role. That's only part of the role of axioms. They actually have some complex roles that Ayn Rand covers in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. She has a whole chapter on it. But they're not what you're deducing from. They form a context from what you're inducing. That's kind of the key point to take away. The second reason that we can think of philosophy, or we can mistakenly come to think of philosophy as deductive, is that there's a distinction between how an originator arrives at knowledge and how we ourselves validate knowledge that we learn from an originator, and the way that inductive knowledge is assembled into an argument and communicated. So when you formulate an argument, you're distilling properly. You're distilling induced knowledge into a series of premises that add up to a conclusion, and it can look deductive in that sense. So if we take Ayn Rand's argument for life as the standard of morality, in pattern what she does is she defines value, or she characterizes value as that which one acts to gain or keep, and notes that it only applies to living entities. And then what are living entities? Well, they're entities that engage in self-generated, self-sustaining action. And then she argues that this presupposes, or understanding value in the context of living entities presupposes that they're acting in the face of an alternative, and that there's only one fundamental alternative, existence or non-existence, and therefore life is the ultimate value. That's not intended as a great description or great characterization of the argument. I'm just giving the bare bones so that we can now say that can seem deductive, right? We're starting from a definition of value, we're looking at a definition of life, and we seem to be drawing a deductive conclusion. But what we're not getting is how she actually arrived at her conclusion, and the process by which we ourselves can validate that conclusion. What we're getting is, in effect, the logical skeleton of inductions and how they're logically related, such that they support the conclusion that the ultimate value is life. And in effect, what she's really doing, I think, is saying, if we more closely examine what goes into inducing our concept of value, or more broadly, any evaluative concepts, we'll see that we can only do so in the context that life, recognizing that life is the ultimate value, and the alternative of life or death is the source of our ability to discriminate whether things are good or bad. So to kind of summarize this point, I would say that the full answer is that objectivism is not due to a priori knowledge or induction or deduction even. It's due to good reasoning, which involves both deduction and induction, but induction is the primary and dominant form of philosophic thinking. So this came from Twitter. When we, as objectivists, look at the left, how do we differentiate between Marxism and nihilism? How do the two interrelate? So I'd say, technically, they're both philosophic doctrines, and in that sense, they're completely different. They're different doctrines. Marxism is a philosophy that views history as a material dialectical process where you have different eras of class exploitation climaxing in a revolution by the proletariat that puts an end to class exploitation, and then we're living in a communist utopia. Nihilism as a doctrine is basically a form of skepticism about all knowledge and all values, and so you can't put them in the same category. They're different. Now, nihilism is not a particularly interesting doctrine, and really it's more, even more than a doctrine that a lot of people went around advocating. It's what thinkers like Nietzsche saw as a potential problem and a major problem in human life that would arise as religion was on the decline. And the worry was, what's left after religion is gone? Is it just going to be total skepticism about knowledge, and particularly about values? Today, we use the term nihilism more to describe a motive, which you might put as destruction for the sake of destruction. And in that sense, there is a relationship between nihilism and Marxism. So Ayn Rand's view, which I think is right, is that evil systems of philosophy like Marxism aren't honestly held positions, certainly not by the originators and the main propagators and the leadership of these movements, that they're systems of rationalization used to justify envy and resentment, or what she called hatred of the good for being the good, which she thought was the most evil motive that human beings can hold, and that human beings actually do hold it, and that in fact you can't even understand human behavior, and certainly not the atrocities of the 20th century, without understanding this motive, and then understanding that ideologies get concocted by some of the more ambitious members or people who hold these motives to justify and kind of propagate this vicious motive. And so, Marxists, we would say, and again, we're taking, this is not anybody who says, oh, like, I think Marx had some good ideas, but her view is that Marxists aren't genuinely moved by some kind of ideal, but by a desire for power and destruction. In that sense, they are nihilistic. It is a nihilistic movement at its essence. It's that, somebody like Marx is taking our ugliest motive, hatred of the good for being the good, and making it justifiable, and therefore making it politically powerful. But part of what goes on then is that the system is a rationalization, and part of what it's doing is it's taking real evils and injustices and facts and manufacturing a lot and exaggerating others and misconceptualizing all of them in order to make the ideology seem palatable to people who are not motivated by these immoral motives. And so many people, if they're not sophisticated, and certainly if they're young, can get taken in by this. So you can't jump from the fact that Marxism as a doctrine is really motivated by nihilism to what that means for any given individual. And certainly if we're talking about, quote, the left, which is a whole range of views, many of which are colored by Marxism, but they're also colored by Enlightenment values. You can't just dismiss them as nihilistic, and certainly you can't do that without recognizing the really immoral motives on the right. So this question is from Michael. Unfortunately, the mainstream concept of justice is focused not on equality under the law, but of outcomes. People see injustice when witnessing wealth inequality, and even if you can persuade others that there are no conflicts in conditions of true freedom, both the rich and the poor are better off, people still object. How do you overcome the widespread view of equality of outcomes being intrinsically moral? I mean, the short answer is that I co-authored a book on this with Yaron Brook called Equals Unfair. But just to give a little bit more on this answer. So on one level, it seems like it should be pretty easy, right, to dispense with the idea that there's anything desirable about economic equality. Like you would just ask, would you rather everybody richer but unequal, or poor but equal? But the problem is that, first of all, many people will answer more equal. And the second is, even if they go, well, I would prefer the latter, it doesn't get you very far, because what you have to understand is that egalitarianism, which, if you want to put it as equality of outcome, I think it's better to think of it as equality of condition, because sometimes there's a focus on outcomes, sometimes there's a focus on opportunity, though, as many egalitarians point out, you can't really make a big distinction between opportunity and outcomes, because they're, in effect, like most things, both means and ends. An opportunity was previously an outcome in many cases. But the thing to understand is that egalitarianism is not a single idea or premise. It's a framework for understanding the world, right? And a framework is a set of methods, assumptions, and goals that shape our thought processes. And for egalitarianism, just to give kind of a sketch of some elements of the framework, in terms of methods, there's an assumption, not always stated, that that all inequalities are the result of injustices. So if we see inequality in the world, we have to assume that there is an injustice. In terms of assumptions, well, it's that we're essentially members of groups. It's a form of collectivism, that we're essentially members of groups with conflicting interests, and a kind of subset assumption under there, or an assumption in a kind of different aspect of here, is that wealth is a collective pie. It belongs to the group, and it's fixed, so that if one group or subgroup gets more, the other groups get less. And so that's, again, there's these conflicting interests that egalitarianism takes for granted. And then finally, their fundamental goal is that, as they would see it, is they want to end oppression by powerful groups of less powerful groups. So this framework, and there's more elements to it, it gives rise to a vast context in the mind of any person who has bought into it or bought into significant parts of it, that influences everything they know, think, believe. And so they have 100 different stories, facts, seeming facts, pseudo facts, observations, personal experiences, all colored by this framework. And so if you just poke a single hole in it, it doesn't get you very far, because it's like adding a single new shingle to a rotting roof. Even if they agree with you in the moment about one item of it, they still have this vast context that's causing them to see the world in a particular way. And so to actually change someone's mind about equality of outcome or condition, you have to uproot the entire framework, and more importantly, supply a better alternative, and then give them some key, reconceptualize a lot of the key facts that they're aware of using this new framework. And I want to underline this point of having a superior framework as an alternative. If all you do in effect is say your framework is garbage, like, that's terrifying to somebody. And I think most objectivists know that feeling, right? That at some point, you've had an experience, probably when you're starting to learn objectivism, that oh my gosh, here's an argument I heard in the internet against objectivism. I need an answer, or it's a crisis because I might lose out on my whole framework, and I need that framework. Now, as you grow and as it becomes really your framework for viewing the world rather than this thing out there that you're learning, part of what happens is nothing can threaten it, because it's just new information that expands your awareness or corrects some of your errors. But there is that feeling of my framework is threatened, and that is something that's like anxiety inducing, if only because it's like, man, I'm gonna have to do a lot of work to rethink everything, and what can I even count on anymore? And so if you're not providing an alternative, you're in effect, by just giving a single argument like that, putting somebody in a crisis. And that's not a pleasant thing for people to be in, particularly if they don't think that there's some next step they can take to get to dry land. And so that's why, if you look what Yaron and I do in Equals Unfair, we're starting with the most plausible case for the egalitarian worldview, and then we're exposing weaknesses in the framework, and ultimately exposing the whole framework and the flaws in its causal explanation of the world. But most of the book is really helping the reader build a new framework and a new way of seeing the world, and conceptualizing the things that people concerned with inequality are concerned with. So this is from Twitter, Book Mistress. Do most adherents treat objectivism as most people treat the Bible? Take the good bits, ignore the bad bits, assume different contexts, or do they treat it as crazed evangelicals treat the Bible, take it all literally and seriously? Well, there's a flaw in the whole question, which is that it treats objectivism as a dogma, and then asks, okay, do you blindly accept the whole dogma, or are you kind of reasonable and like, well, I'll just take little bits of dogma? And notice you wouldn't ask this kind of question about a science. Like, you wouldn't say, do most physicists blindly accept Einstein's theory of relativity, or do they just take the bits that they like? And it doesn't make sense to talk about a science in terms of taking it literally or seriously. It's a science. It's by definition literal and serious. And the point is that philosophy, properly done, is a science. It's taking this inherent need that we have for a fundamental unified view of human life and of the world that human beings inhabit, and it's making it an issue of argument rather than dogma. And so the first question of philosophy is not like, hey, are people just picking bits or accepting it whole cloth? It's is this system of ideas, are these principles true? Are they right? And so objectivists are people who think that Rand got the right answer, that the principles she defined are right. And then there's some people who are not objectivists but think, well, she got some right rather than others. And so it's not, and so from their view, what's going on is they're going to pick the good bits, the knowledge that they think is true, and reject the others. So that's why I'm dismissive of the question. It's on the wrong premise. But there's a reason I'm sympathetic to it. And that's, I do think it's true that many people who call themselves objectivists, or a significant number, have been semi-religious. And I say semi because I don't think there's a big, like, it's not like religion where people just accept objectivism without thought and, to be social conformists, right? Like, that is not, that doesn't really happen. I think what typically would happen is they would be persuaded by many of the arguments. But in effect, then they would prematurely just sort of swear fidelity to the structure so that they could, call themselves an objectivist. And then what happens is it becomes their core identity. Just like I'm a Christian is like something like people are putting in their Twitter bios. It's I'm an objectivist. And so they walk around then afraid of like betraying objectivism or questioning it too hard, and worry about like, am I getting all the dogma right? Like, oh my gosh, I like Nas or Kendrick Lamar. Does that make me like not an objectivist, or is Ayn Rand staring down at me disapprovingly from heaven? And in many ways, that's religion's fault, because religion has been our only model of what it means to hold and try to live by a worldview. Now, thankfully, I think this approach to objectivism is becoming increasingly rare. Like, even over the 20 years I've been involved in the philosophy, I've seen less of this attitude. And I give a lot of credit, first and foremost, to Leonard Peikoff, who has been fighting it since, for decades and decades. But in particular, ARI has really kind of taken an aggressive role in trying to like beat that out of the movement. If you join the Objectivist Academic Center, for example, it is not a friendly place to be if you have this kind of dogmatic attitude. It will it will not get you credit, versus if you're challenging and really thinking about the ideas, like that's what's prized, not agreement. But there is a similar attitude that I think continues to be prevalent, and is bad as well. It's what my friend Alex Epstein has called treating objectivism as a club. And in effect, it's people who engage with objectivism the same way that like Comic-Con fans engage with their favorite comic or TV or movie series. And it's like they love reading the books, they love talking about the ideas, they love going to the conferences, they love using the jargon, they love comparing people in the world to characters in Ayn Rand's novels, and it becomes part of their identity to be part of like the objectivist fandom, right? And what they're not doing is they're not using the philosophy, using it as a tool for guiding their thinking and their actions. And the real mark here is if you get them talking about any subject other than something that's like straight objectivism, they're strikingly conventional. Like, you would not know about their interest in objectivism except for them talking about objectivism or related topics. And if you contrast that, like if I contrast that to my best friends in the objectivist universe, you could have hours and hours long conversation with nothing like notably objectivist coming up. But what you will notice is that these are not conventional people. They see the world in really fresh ways, and they're saying things you've never heard, whether you're just talking about like baseball, or whether you're talking about, you know, like the meal you're eating, or whether they're talking about kind of their career, education. It's that they have a unique way of coming at the world that leads them to be unusual in a positive sense about everything that they approach. And so, you know, my advice is like, take objectivism very seriously, but not as a club and not as a religion, as a tool to help you live a better life and think about the world in a much clearer way. All right, so this is from Justin. And this is kind of related to the last one. Why are so many of the intellectual faces of objectivism so awkward in public? I mean, it might be directed at me, who knows? And why do some of these same people often seem like they don't experience any joy on a regular basis? Those are two things that have always confused me about the philosophy. Some of its biggest proponents seem miserable and unable to interact with the world around them. Well, I'll agree that some, if not many of us, are awkward in public. And I don't think that's for any particularly interesting reason. I think it's that most people become deeply interested in philosophy or deeply interested in ideas. This is true in academia. Tend to be introverts, tend to be, you know, shy. And like even me, if you put me in an unfamiliar social context, like I'm usually good at not being awkward, but internally, like I have very high social anxiety. Not at a place like O'Connor where I'm speaking and there's some status and people know me already. But like if I'm going into a situation where I don't know anybody and they all know each other, like it took me a long time to realize, all right, how do I stop just kind of standing on the sidelines? And for what it's worth, and basically what I learned to do is just go to the first group that I could, and if it was, you know, nervous, the first group that looked friendly, and just introduce myself and just say, hi, I'm Don. Like, and usually 99 times out of 100, people are friendly. Works less well at a nightclub for various reasons, but in most social situations, that'll kind of break you in. But even then, unless we find a topic that really excites me, it's very effortful for me to like try to, you know, keep everything comfortable. It takes a lot of effort and I find it exhausting. So I don't think this is really an objectivist problem. I actually think objectivism helps. It makes you feel more confident and less concerned with what people think of you. On the happiness side of it, let me say a few things. So I would say that on the whole, most of the objectivists I know seem pretty happy, but that is a hard thing to say because happiness is extremely private. It's a perspective on how your life is going internally and externally, and it's really hard to know whether the person you love is genuinely happy, much less like an acquaintance or something. What I will say is that I think happiness is often quiet. You'll perceive it more as a certain kind of comfort and serenity in somebody than like an outright joy, and certainly not boisterousness. Like the life of the party is often, though not always, putting on an act to disguise a real unhappiness. Finally, like we have to remember, objectivism is a philosophy, and philosophy is, I think in many ways, a precondition to achieving happiness. It's giving you explicit guidance on how you live your life and how you judge your life, including how you judge your moral character, that is super helpful for happiness, but it's not all there is to the story. So first of all, even if you know the philosophy and you live by it, not all the people who can preach it well live by it. It doesn't necessarily shape their lives just because they're out there preaching it. But even setting that aside, objectivism is not sufficient for happiness because first, there can be just existential things in your life that are wrong. So we are not Stoics. We don't believe that you should be happy like no matter what. You know, if you just like are getting a divorce or lost a child or your job is going in a really rough way or like you ran out of money There's a lot of, you're locked indoors from a pandemic for months on end. You might not be happy. There are actual values that are going to contribute to happiness that if you don't have them, you can be miserable, even if you're on a rational course of action, even if you have full self-esteem, even if the pain, as Rourke puts it, only goes down to a certain point. But even apart from that, you can face profound psychological barriers to happiness. And like, that's something to really take seriously, is even if you're a completely moral person, right? Like, we all grew up before we were self-aware enough to understand, the world that's happening to us and the best way to cope with things. And you can develop really bad, challenging, and sometimes tragic psychological issues that you have to cope with. And Objectivism doesn't fix those. It can help you fix those. It can be extremely helpful in fixing those. But you can be the most moral person in the world and struggle with depression, with anxiety, and with other psychological challenges. So here's how I think about it. Objectivism, and I'll just speak for myself, Objectivism, to the extent I've understood it and practice it, has made my life far better and far happier than it would otherwise be. And that's the most you can ask from any philosophy. And it's a lot to get from a philosophy. A couple more. Lisa asks, how does Objectivism relate to the liberty movement? Are they the same thing? So, Objectivism is a philosophy, and as a movement, it's a philosophic movement that wants to reshape the guiding principles for individual life and for culture, not just politics. Whereas the liberty movement, at its best, it's a movement that seeks to establish certain political principles and certain political policies. Now, I use the liberty movement in my work because I'm trying to reach a specific audience, and I need some sort of language that allows them to recognize that I'm speaking to them. And so I can't use language that they wouldn't use themselves. And so I choose liberty movement because I think it's the best way to so that people know, hey, when I'm teaching you to be a better advocate of liberty, like, these are the people that I'm talking to. But if I'm being precise, I don't think there genuinely is a liberty movement in the proper sense. I don't think that many of the views associated with this movement are pro-liberty. A movement is it's a group of people working together to advance a shared set of ideas. But there are people in the liberty movement who I think are advancing ideas that are antithetical to liberty, whether it's kind of like hardcore conservatives or anarchists who these people reject a rights-protecting limited government and reject individualism. They reject profound, important components of what it means to be for liberty. And so, I regard these people as opponents to mine. Now, many of the people who fall into these positions, actually, you can say they have their heart in the right place. So I'm interested in reaching them. But in terms of, like, are we part of a same movement pushing for the same values? No, we're not. It also doesn't include, the liberty movement doesn't include many people who do share many of my ideas. So, many of the people who call themselves liberals and who believe, at least outside of the economic sphere, in what we think of as classically liberal values of free thought and open exchange of ideas, I regard them on certain issues as allies. So liberty movement's not a great term. It's certainly better than what I think is a fully polluted term like libertarianism, which I wouldn't use even for marketing purposes. But in terms of clarity about, like, is there a movement today that is for liberty in a genuine sense that we can be all out for? No, I don't think there's any fully healthy movements for anything. The Objectivist movement is barely a movement, and so it's even hard to call that. We're trying to make strides to turn it into a genuine movement. There's people who share these sets of ideas, but are they taking any sort of organized action? We're in the very early stages of that, and there's a lot of work to do. Final question. Did Ayn Rand really believe in full tabula rasa, a blank slate? Does the fact that genetics play a huge role in IQ and even self-control have any implications for Rand's ethical conclusions that flow out of her tabula rasa premise? So objectivism does hold that human beings are born tabula rasa, a blank slate, but that's a much more delimited claim than most people think, and possibly than other thinkers who talk about tabula rasa would claim. All it means for objectivists is that the human mind starts out with any content, with any cognitive content. There's no innate ideas. Knowledge starts with sense perception. We talked about that. And so you can't have any knowledge until you have perception, which in any meaningful sense starts at birth. But that leaves a lot of room for what do we have at birth, or at least what do we have that is kind of inborn and innate into us, and that's really a question for scientists, not for philosophy. Clearly, there's a lot about us that is innate. Like at a minimum, you'd have to say that our structures are innate, right? We have a mind that functions in a certain way, a pleasure-pain mechanism, certain emotional capacities tied to certain evaluations. Like it's universal that if we judge something as an injustice, the emotional response is anger. So there's a lot that is innate in being a human being. But like, do we know the full extent of what's innate and what's not? I don't think it is known. It's certainly not known to me. And it's very hard to figure out. What ethical implications does this have for objectivism? Well, ethics has to do with choice, right? And so given your identity and the options that are open to you, do you make the best choice or don't you? Do you take what you see as the most rational life-promoting path or don't you? And what objectivism's commitment to tabula rasa says is that there's nothing innate that prevents you from making better or worse choices. There's nothing innate that commits you to certain ideas or values against your control. And in effect, you can say that objectivism's ethics is firmly rooted in free will, your ability to use your mind to understand reality or not. And what we say is that there's nothing innate that prevents us from using free will from exercising our free will and using it to guide our lives in positive, life-promoting ways. But let me end by this, by distinguishing this from the whole IQ debate, because this whole area is a mess. First, we have to keep in mind that IQ is not like a thing. It's not a feature of an individual human being. It's not like you have an IQ and I have an IQ in the way that, like I have a hand or I have an eye. IQ is, in any rational sense, a statistical measure that has shown itself to be useful for making certain predictions about groups of people. It says nothing about the individual, literally nothing. And it is not clear that IQ in this sense is innate, even in part. The argument that, clearly it's at least partly innate in people. Again, it's not in people, and to the extent you can even sensibly, coherently talk about it being in an individual, the arguments that it's some innate asset of human beings is not very good. And the best analysis I've seen by this, and I'm not a specialist in the field, but I found it very useful because he really looks at what is the state of the existing evidence, is a book called Innate by Kevin J. Mitchell. The most important thing, though, and this is what I really want to highlight, is that to the extent that there's that IQ is allegedly about anything, it's not about your capacity to live by reason. The issue is not if your IQ is at a certain point, you can live by reason or not. And yet that's the only thing relevant in a political context. For political issues, what's relevant is, are we beings who have the capacity to live by the conceptual level? And your level of intelligence, once you pass like a certain very, very basic threshold, is totally irrelevant to whether you have rights and the ability to exercise them. And so anybody who says, we need to talk about IQ in order to make policy decisions is and I apologize for it, but like, is full of shit. That is totally irrelevant in terms of making policy decisions. And I don't know any other way to put it, or rather I do know other ways to put it, but I think it would be even more controversial. And so I'll leave it at that IQ has nothing to do with political and policy debates. And I'm, the people who are trying to inject that into it, I'm very, very suspicious of their motives, and certainly I disagree with it as a method. But the positive point is that, it's our fundamental capacity to reason that gives rise to our need to live free by rights, regardless of our level of intelligence, and that equating intelligence and IQ, I think, is a mistake. That it's something that is statistically relevant, maybe for some sorts of issues. It's not relevant to us as individuals living our lives and demanding freedom to live our lives. So that's it for this first installment of I don't even have a good title for it yet, but for Objectivist Q&A. Again, let me know how you think. Email me at don@donswriting.com, and look forward to your feedback and look forward to addressing more questions next time. Till then.